The envelope hit the table so hard the coffee cup rattled. "Get out," Harold Briggs said, not even looking up from his ledger. "Your uncle's debts don't transfer to his kin, but his welcome sure doesn't either." Clara Whitlock stood in the middle of the Silver Creek Savings and Loan, 24 years old, $8 to her name, and every eye in that office pretending not to watch her fall apart. The landlord beside Briggs, a man she'd never met before this morning, was already reaching for the room key she'd been sleeping with under her pillow for 3 nights. Not asking, taking. "I just need 2 weeks," she said. Her voice didn't shake. She'd promised herself it wouldn't. "You need a husband," Briggs said flatly. "That's what women in your situation need." She picked up the envelope off the table. Inside it was a bill of debt, $462 her uncle had borrowed, never repaid, and somehow made her responsible for by simply dying before she could find him. The paper was crisp and official and completely merciless. She walked out of that office with her chin up, and the moment the door closed behind her, her legs nearly gave out on the wooden porch. If you've ever been somewhere completely alone, holding something you can't fix, breathing through something that feels unsurvivable, this story is for you. Stay with me to the very end, because what happens next in Clara Whitlock's life is something none of us saw coming. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one, and hit that like button right now. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Silver Creek, Colorado, 1789. And we're just getting started. The porch of the Silver Creek Hotel was the kind of place that collected people nobody knew what to do with. A drunk sleeping off a bad Tuesday. A traveling salesman waiting on a stage that ran late more often than not. And now Clara Whitlock, sitting on the far end of the bench with her travel bag between her feet and her hands folded in her lap like she was trying to hold herself together through sheer grip strength. She'd been sitting there for an hour. She wasn't crying. She was past crying. She'd done that on the train west, 3 days of watching the flat Kansas prairie turn into something bigger and more indifferent, crying into a handkerchief until she ran out of tears and then just staring. By the time the Rockies came up on the horizon, she was empty. By the time she reached Silver Creek, she was something harder than empty. She was numb in the particular way that comes right before a person either breaks or decides not to. She hadn't decided yet. Her uncle's letter had found her in Cincinnati 2 months ago. "Come west, Clara. I have land. I have a house. You can have a real life out here." She'd read it 7 times. She'd held it up to the window light like maybe there was a hidden message between the lines, some catch she was missing. There wasn't. Or maybe there was, and the catch was that Fletcher Whitlock had always been a man whose intentions outran his ability to back them up, and cancer doesn't negotiate with good intentions. He'd been dead 6 weeks by the time she stepped off the stage into Silver Creek's Main Street. A woman named Mrs. Pearl Hensley at the general store had told her, in the gentle and terrible way that small towns deliver bad news. Quietly, with her hands clasped and her eyes full of something that might have been pity or might have been relief that it wasn't her problem. "Your uncle passed, dear. Pneumonia at first, they thought, but turned out to be his lungs all along. He went peaceful." And then a pause. "He did leave some debts." Some debts. $462 was 3 years of wages for most women in Clara's position. So she sat on the hotel porch in the September afternoon sun and thought about $8.62, which was what she had after paying for 2 nights' lodging, and tried to figure out what a person does next when the entire premise of their future has just been canceled without warning. That was when she heard the small voice. "You look like you lost something." She looked up. Standing at the bottom of the porch steps was a boy. Couldn't have been more than 6 years old, maybe 7, with dark hair that needed cutting badly, and a shirt that had been washed so many times the blue had faded to something closer to sky. He was looking at her with the kind of direct, unfiltered attention that only children and very old people allow themselves. "I'm fine," she said, automatic, hollow. "My pa says people say that when they're not," the boy said. Clara looked at him more carefully. There was mud on his boots, real working mud, not play mud, and he was standing with his hands in his pockets, the way men stand when they're carrying something they don't want to show. "Your father sounds like a smart man," she said. "He says smart things sometimes," the boy agreed. He climbed the bottom step. Not all the way up, just 1 step, like he was testing whether she'd wave him off. "My name's Eli." Clara, what did you lose? She didn't know why she didn't just say nothing again. Maybe she was too tired to lie twice. Maybe there was something about the boy's face, young and serious and completely without judgment, that made the usual defenses feel unnecessary. My plan, she said. I came here with a plan, and it didn't work out. Eli considered this. Pa's plans don't work out a lot, he said. The fence he was going to fix last spring still isn't fixed. Despite everything, despite the grief and the humiliation of that morning and the $8.62 sitting in her coat pocket like an accusation, she almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. How many children does your father have? She asked. 3. Me and Rose, she's 8, and the baby, Nate. He's almost 2. Eli paused. We don't have a mother. He said it the way children say things that adults have decided not to say out loud, not with self-pity. Just as a statement of fact, the way you'd say we don't have a barn cat anymore or we ran out of sugar. Matter of fact, real. Clara felt something in her chest that had nothing to do with her own troubles. I'm sorry, she said. She died when Nate came, Eli said. He climbed another step. Pa doesn't talk about it much. Rose cries sometimes at night, but she doesn't think I hear her. I do, though. Clara didn't know what to say to that. What does a stranger say to a child carrying something that heavy? She'd learned early in life that sometimes the most honest answer is silence. So she sat with his words for a moment, let them settle. Eli. The voice came from the street. Low, not loud, but the kind of voice that carries without trying to. The man coming toward the porch steps was tall. Not imposing tall, just the kind of tall that comes from a life lived outdoors, where you spend years reaching for things and hauling things, and your body eventually just builds itself around the work. He had dark hair like the boys, going gray at the temples in a way that put him somewhere in his mid-30s, and he was wearing the particular look of a man who has been looking for his child and is relieved to find him not dead, but is going to have words about this later. I told you to wait at the feed store, the man said. I was just talking, Eli said, utterly unapologetic. The man looked up at Clara then. Just a quick, direct look. The kind of look that people use to assess whether they need to apologize for their child or whether the situation has sorted itself without damage. Sorry about that, he said. He wanders. He was fine, Clara said. And she meant it. The man nodded. He was about to turn away. She could see it, the polite dismissal, the I'll get him out of your way, when Eli said, casually, with the devastating instinct of small children for saying the exact wrong thing at the exact right moment, Pa, she lost her plan, like you lost yours when the north pasture flooded. The man stopped. He looked at Clara again. This time the look was different, not pity. She'd had enough pity that day to last a decade, something more careful than pity, like he was trying to figure out what was true. You just get in? He asked. 3 days ago, she said. And then, because he hadn't asked and she didn't know why she was telling him, she said, I came to stay with my uncle. He passed before I arrived. A beat of silence. Fletcher Whitlock? He said. She blinked. You knew him? Everybody in Silver Creek knew Fletcher. He said it without judgment, which was somehow kinder than anything careful he could have said. He put his hand on Eli's shoulder. Come on, son. Nice to meet you, Clara, Eli said, like a small adult. I hope you find another plan. They went down the steps and into the street. Clara watched them go. The man, she didn't even know his name, walked with the boy the way fathers walk with children they love, but don't always know how to talk to. One hand still on the shoulder, not holding, just there. She sat with that for a while. The next morning, she found work. Not good work. Not the kind of work she'd imagined when she'd packed her bag in Cincinnati and let herself dream about a new start. The Silver Creek Steam Laundry was exactly what the name promised. A hot, wet, exhausting room at the back of a building where 3 women and Clara stood over tubs of boiling water for 10 hours at a stretch, washing the sheets and shirts and tablecloths of everyone in town who could afford not to wash their own. The woman who ran it was named Mrs. Agnes Tully, 50s, iron gray hair, forearms like a blacksmith, and a manner that didn't waste a single word on pleasantries. She'd looked Clara up and down on the doorstep that morning and said, You strong? Clara had said yes. Agnes had said, We'll see, and handed her an apron. By noon, Clara's hands were raw. By 3 o'clock, her back had opinions about her life choices. By the time the whistle blew at 6, she was so tired she walked home to her small rented room. Second floor, back of the boarding house, just big enough for a bed and a chair and her bag, and sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the wall and thought, this is survivable. This is not comfortable, but it is survivable. She paid for the room. She had $7 left. She allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of feeling sorry for herself, and then she got up and washed her face and went to bed. She didn't expect to see the man again. That's not entirely true. Silver Creek was small enough that you saw everyone again. The town had maybe 400 people in a main street that took 3 minutes to walk end to end. She'd already seen Harold Briggs twice and had managed to look straight through him both times, which she considered a personal achievement. But she hadn't expected to see the tall man with the boy in any context that involved her specifically. She was at the general store on her first day off, a Saturday, buying the few things she could afford: soap, a small bag of flour, some salt pork. She was doing the math in her head the way she'd been doing it constantly, that running calculation of dollars against necessities, when she rounded the end of an aisle and nearly walked directly into him. He stepped back. She stepped back. For a moment, they both stood there with the particular awkwardness of people who have no formal connection but share information they didn't plan to share. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "I don't know your name," she said, because there was no graceful way around it. "Garrett Rowan." He shifted the flour sack he was carrying to his other arm. "Eli hasn't stopped talking about you." That surprised her. "We talked for 10 minutes. "Eli doesn't measure things in minutes," Garrett said. He said it simply, without embarrassment, the way parents speak about children they understand even when they can't explain them. "He said you were the saddest person he ever saw who wasn't crying." Clara opened her mouth and then closed it again. She wasn't sure if that was an insult or the most accurate thing anyone had said about her in months. "He's perceptive," she said finally. "Too perceptive," Garrett said. And there, just for a fraction of a second, something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "I heard you took work at Agnes Tully's. News travels. 400 people," he said, by way of explanation. She nodded. She was about to make the polite noises of ending the conversation when he said, "She'll work you hard. Agnes is fair, but she's not easy." "I don't need easy," Clara said. He looked at her for a moment in that direct, careful way he had. "No," he said, like he was agreeing with something he'd already figured out on his own. "I don't imagine you do." And then he nodded, hitched the flour sack higher, and went toward the counter. Clara stood in the aisle for a moment, flour and salt pork and soap in her arms, and felt something she hadn't felt in days. Seen. Not pitied. Seen. It was a small thing. She told herself it was nothing. She didn't entirely believe herself. October came to Silver Creek like a warning. The air went sharp overnight, the kind of cold that doesn't apologize. And Clara learned what the women at the laundry meant when they'd said August was the easy month. The steam from the tubs turned from oppressive to something she actively needed, and she'd stopped noticing the burn in her hands the way you stop noticing a sound that never changes. She'd been in Silver Creek 6 weeks. She knew the rhythms now. She knew that Mrs. Pearl Hensley at the general store closed 15 minutes early on Fridays because her husband liked supper on the table by 6. She knew that the drunk who slept on the hotel porch was named Clement and had a daughter in Denver who sent him letters he never answered. She knew that Agnes Tully had been running the laundry for 11 years since her husband left, not died, left, and that nobody brought it up because Agnes had made her opinion of the subject clear once and didn't plan to repeat herself. She was becoming part of the texture of the place without meaning to. The children found her first. Rose was 8 and operated with the particular combination of wariness and desperate curiosity that belongs to girls who have had to figure out too much too young. The first time she came into the laundry, she'd brought her father's shirts that needed mending as well as washing, a job Agnes normally turned away but made an exception for, apparently, because Garrett Rowan had once helped her haul a broken boiler across town in the middle of the night without being asked. Rose stood at the counter and stared at Clara like she was something she was trying to read. "You're the one Eli talked to on the porch," Rose said. "I am," Clara said. "He said you were sad." "I was having a hard day." Rose considered this with great seriousness. Are you still sad? Some days, Clara said honestly. Rose absorbed this. Then, my mother used to say sad days were just tired days in a bad hat. Clara didn't know what to say to that. She stood with it for a moment. She sounds like she was wise, she said. She was, Rose said, and the word was sat between them with all its weight. Rose put the bundle of shirts on the counter. Papa said to tell Agnes he's obliged. I'll tell her. Rose turned to leave, then stopped. She looked back over her shoulder with that same careful, assessing look her father had. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? I don't know, Rose said. Just not this. And she left without explaining what this was. Clara thought about it for the rest of the day. It was Garrett himself who came on a Thursday in the third week of October, and he came not to the laundry, but to the boarding house where Clara lived, which was itself a statement whether he meant it to be or not, because in Silver Creek you didn't go to a woman's residence without a reason the whole town could see clearly. He brought a sack. Apples. A dozen of them, red and hard and smelling of the trees she'd grown up around in Ohio, which she hadn't realized she missed until they were in her hands. From the back orchard, he said. He was standing at the bottom of the porch steps. He seemed to have a relationship with the bottom step of porches, she'd noticed, like he didn't want to commit to coming up without an invitation. Tree went wild this year. We've got more than we can use. Thank you, she said. She meant it simply, completely. He nodded. He didn't move to leave, but he didn't come up the steps either, and she understood instinctively that he was the kind of man who could stand comfortably in the space between committed and withdrawn. He'd spent years there, probably. Rose told me she came to the laundry, he said. She did. She's a remarkable girl. She's been talking about you, he said. Which is, she doesn't talk much, since. He stopped. Started again differently. I wanted to say I hope she wasn't a bother. She wasn't, Clara said. She told me something her mother said, about sad days. Garrett went very still for a moment. Then, the tired days in a bad hat one? Yes. He made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something in between. Margaret said that to her about 100 times. A pause. Rose hasn't said it to anyone else since Margaret died, as far as I know. Clara didn't know what to do with that, so she held the apples and let the moment be what it was. Your children are kind, she said finally. Someone raised them well. He looked up at her. Margaret did, he said. Honest. No hesitation. And you, Clara said. He shook his head slightly, but he didn't argue. He turned to go. Then, with his back still half turned, if the apples aren't enough, there's a root cellar going to waste on the south side of the property. More squash than we can eat before it turns. You're welcome to it. And he walked away before she could say anything that might have made it complicated. She stood on the boarding house porch with 12 apples in her arms and thought, this man is going to be a problem. She didn't mean it as a bad thing. She wasn't sure what she meant it as. She went inside and sat at her small table and ate one of the apples in the last of the evening light. And the taste of it, sharp and real and nothing like anything she'd eaten in months of grief and survival, made her eyes sting unexpectedly. She pressed her palm flat against the table and held herself together. Outside, Silver Creek was going quiet for the night. A dog barked somewhere 2 streets over. A lamp went out in the window across the way. Somewhere on the edge of town, she knew, a man was putting 3 children to bed in a house that had survived without its center, getting along without flourishing, breathing without anything close to living. She knew the feeling. She finished the apple. She thought, maybe surviving isn't the worst thing to have in common. And somewhere in the dark and the cold, and the distant sound of the town settling into sleep, something in Clara Whitlock, something that had been clenched and braced and waiting since the moment that envelope hit the table at the Silver Creek Savings and Loan, loosened. Not much, but enough. The squash was real. Clara had half expected it to be a polite offer, the kind people make when they don't think you'll actually take them up on it. The Colorado Frontier version of we should get together sometime, meaning nothing, obligating no one. But she'd thought about it for 2 days, and then on a Saturday morning she walked the 1.5 miles out to the Rowan Ranch with a flour sack over her shoulder, because $8 had become $5, and pride was something she could afford less of with every passing week. The ranch was not what she'd imagined. She didn't know exactly what she'd imagined, Something rougher, maybe. Or more defeated. A widower with 3 children and a flooded north pasture and a fence that hadn't been fixed since spring. She'd built a picture in her mind of a place held together with stubbornness and not much else. And there was some truth to that picture. The front gate hung at an angle that said the hinge had been broken for a while. The yard between the house and the barn had the particular look of a place where function had won every argument against appearance for years. But the house itself was solid. Heavy timber, good stone foundation, a covered porch that ran the full width of the front. Someone had built this place to last, built it with the intention of something permanent growing here. You could see it in the bones. The neglect was surface neglect, the kind that comes from too much work and not enough hands, not from not caring. She was standing at the gate, deciding whether to knock or just go around back toward where she assumed a root cellar would be, when the front door opened and Rose appeared on the porch with the expression of someone who has been watching from the window for several minutes and is done pretending otherwise. "He said you probably wouldn't come," Rose said. "Did he?" Clara pushed the gate open. It protested. "I said you would." Rose came down the porch steps without ceremony. "The cellar's around the south side. I'll show you." They went around the house in the thin November morning light, and Clara followed the girl the way you follow someone who is doing you a favor. They've decided not to make a big thing of. Rose was 8 going on 40, was what she'd concluded. The kind of child that grief accelerates. The root cellar door was set into a low mound behind the house. Old wood, iron pull ring, the smell of earth and cold and stored things when Rose hauled it open. Clara looked in. Garrett hadn't been understating the case. There was more squash down there than a family of 5 could eat in a winter. Several varieties she recognized and at least one she didn't, along with dried herbs hanging from the low ceiling beams and a row of mason jars going cloudy with age. "Mama always put up too much," Rose said. She said it flat, not fishing for sympathy, just noting a fact about a person who had existed. "Good instinct for a frontier winter," Clara said, equally flat. She picked up 2 large butternuts and put them in her sack. "You can take more than that." "I'll take what I'll use." Rose watched her for a moment. "Most people take whatever they can get when someone offers." "I know," Clara said. "I'm trying not to be most people." Something in Rose's face shifted slightly. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the very early stages of recalculation. She crouched down and picked up a 3rd squash and held it out without comment. Clara took it without comment. That was the whole transaction. They were closing the cellar door when Eli came running around the corner of the house with the uncontrolled velocity of small boys who have somewhere to be and no particular idea where that is. He skidded to a stop in the dirt when he saw Clara, and his face did something simple and unguarded that no adult face ever does anymore. It just lit up, completely and immediately. "You came," he said. "I came," Clara said. "I told Pa you would." He looked at Rose. "I told her too." "Everyone told everyone," Rose said. "Go tell Pa she's here." "He's in the barn," Eli said. "He knows. He saw her coming up the road from the hayloft window." And then he ran off again in a different direction for reasons known only to himself. Clara looked at Rose. Rose looked at the middle distance with studied innocence. "He was just checking on the horses," Rose said. "Of course," Clara said. Garrett came out of the barn about 10 minutes later, when Clara was already through the gate and heading back toward the road. She heard him behind her and turned. "You didn't have to leave so fast," he said. "I got what I came for. I didn't want to take up your morning." He fell into step beside her without being invited and without making a thing of it. He had a way of doing that, occupying space near her without pressing into it. She'd noticed it before, on the hotel porch, in the general store. He didn't push. "Rose talk your ear off?" he asked. Rose is careful with her words. That's a kind way to put it. She didn't used to be. He was quiet for a moment. Before she talked the way Eli does, constant about everything. Another pause. "She stopped after Margaret died. Started again, some, but not the same." Clara shifted the flour sack to her other shoulder. "She told me about the tired days and the bad hat." "She told me she told you." He glanced sideways at her. "I don't know what to make of that." Maybe she just needed someone to tell it to who didn't already know it. He walked a few more steps in silence. Then, yeah, that might be it." They reached the bend in the road where the ranch track joined the main path into town. Garrett stopped. She stopped. This was a natural stopping place, the place where he'd go back and she'd go on, and they both knew it. "The cellar's there all winter," he said. "Come back when you need more." "I'll earn it," Clara said. "If there's mending or any kind of work needs doing, I sew well, I can cook, I'm decent with accounts if your books need." "Clara," he said her name simply, interrupting her without force. "It's squash. You don't have to earn squash." She looked at him. He looked back, steady and direct, and she understood that this was one of those moments where accepting something gracefully is harder than anything else, and also the only right thing to do. "Thank you," she said, without the addendum, without the offer. "Just thank you." He nodded. "I'll tell Eli you'll come back." "It'll keep him from worrying," she said, and she started down the road toward town, and she didn't look back, but she was aware of the fact that she walked the whole 1.5 miles without once doing the running arithmetic of dollars against necessities in her head. That was the first time that had happened in 6 weeks. November built itself up slowly, and then collapsed all at once into a cold that meant business. The first real snow came on a Wednesday, and by Thursday morning, Silver Creek had gone white and quiet in the particular way of mountain towns where winter is not a season, but a reckoning. The laundry ran hotter than ever, which was the one mercy of the season, and Clara's hands had toughened past raw into something that just worked without complaint, which she took as a kind of progress. Agnes Tully had started leaving the back room unlocked on the days Clara opened up alone, which was not nothing. Agnes communicated trust through access, not words, and Clara had figured that out fast enough. It was in the back room one Thursday morning, before the other women arrived, that Clara heard the front door and came out to find a woman she'd seen around town but never spoken to. Fine coat, careful hair, the kind of posture that announces money without announcing itself. She was holding a bundle of tablecloths and looking at Clara with the specific expression of someone running a quiet assessment. "You're the Whitlock girl," the woman said. "Clara Whitlock," Clara said. "Can I help you?" "Dorothea Marsh," she set the tablecloths on the counter. "My husband is Walter Marsh, the Marsh Lumber Company." She said this the way people say things they expect you to react to. Clara took the tablecloths and began counting them. "I'll have these back to you by Saturday." "My husband spoke about you," Dorothea Marsh said. "He mentioned to Harold Briggs that you'd come in about Fletcher's debts. Harold told Walter you handled yourself well." Clara stopped counting. She looked up. "Did he?" "Harold doesn't say that about many people." Dorothea was still doing the assessment, going about it less subtly now. "I understand you're working for Agnes." "I am." "And staying at the Connolly boarding house." "Also correct." Dorothea was quiet for a moment, rearranging something in her thinking. "My husband has a nephew," she said. "Edwin Marsh. He's 38, never married, manages the Eastern accounts for the lumber company. He'll be in Silver Creek through the spring." She paused. "He's not unattractive. He has a house in Denver." Clara set the tablecloths down. She kept her voice level. "Mrs. Marsh, I appreciate the kindness you're intending, I do, but I'm not looking to be arranged." "I'm not arranging," Dorothea said, and she sounded slightly wounded in the way of women who believe they are helping. "I'm mentioning there's a difference." "There is," Clara agreed. "Saturday for the tablecloths." Dorothea Marsh left with her chin at the angle of someone who has been graciously rebuffed and has not yet decided whether to forgive it. Clara stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed, hands flat on the wood, breathing. The thing was, she wasn't even angry. She was something more complicated than angry. She understood the logic of what Dorothea had said, understood it completely, because the math of a woman alone in 1889 with no family and no money, and a job that paid barely enough to eat was not a comfortable math, and a house in Denver was not nothing. Edwin Marsh was probably fine, probably decent, probably the kind of man who had solved the practical problem of her existence completely. She picked up the tablecloths and took them to the back. She didn't think about Edwin Marsh again until he walked into the laundry himself 3 days later, and by then she'd already made up her mind about things she hadn't fully admitted she was making her mind up about. Edwin Marsh was, in fact, not unattractive. He was also aware of it in the way that men who've been told they're not unattractive since adolescents tend to be. He came in on a Saturday, framed the visit as a question about picking up his aunt's tablecloths, and stayed for 20 minutes having a conversation that Clara recognized as a performance of effortlessness that had actually been rehearsed, at least partially. He was funny, she'd give him that. And he was interested, genuinely interested in what she thought, or performing genuine interest so well, the difference was academic. He asked about Cincinnati. He asked about what she'd expected when she came west. He did not, notably, ask about her uncle's debts or her financial situation or any of the things that would have made the conversation feel like an inspection, which was itself a kind of consideration. When he left, tablecloths under his arm, tipping his hat at the door, Agnes appeared from the back room like she'd materialized from the steam itself. "Edwin Marsh," Agnes said. "I know. His uncle owns half the timber in this county." "I know that too." Agnes looked at her with the flat, appraising gaze of a woman who has seen everything and formed opinions about most of it. "You're going to do something foolish," she said. "Probably," Clara said, "but not about Edwin Marsh." Agnes made a sound that was either approval or resignation and went back to her boiler. "What?" The foolish thing happened on a Tuesday. Garrett had stopped by the laundry. Not for the first time, he'd been by twice before with mending from the ranch, Eli's jacket, and a pair of Rose's school boots that needed a buckle replaced. And he'd waited at the counter with the patience of a man used to waiting, and when Clara brought the finished items out, he paid without argument, and then stood there with his hat in his hands for a moment too long. "Eli asked if you'd come to Sunday supper," he said. Clara looked at him. "Eli asked?" "Yes." A pause. "I didn't argue with him about it." Which was, she understood, the closest thing to an invitation she was going to get, so she said yes before she could think herself out of it, and that was how she ended up at the Rowan Ranch table the following Sunday, with 3 children and a man who served her coffee before he served himself, and didn't make any kind of scene about it. The supper was imperfect in every way she immediately loved. Eli knocked his water glass over before the meal started, and Garrett righted it and mopped it with his sleeve and said, "Watch your elbow," in the tone of a man who has said this 10,000 times. The baby, Nate, ate approximately 8% of what was put in front of him and used the remaining 92% as material for a private project. Rose served the bread with a formality that was both touching and slightly heartbreaking, the way children take on adult tasks to fill spaces that shouldn't need filling. Garrett cooked, not elegantly. The beans were slightly underseasoned and the cornbread had caught on the bottom, and he didn't apologize for any of it, just put it on the table and let it be what it was, and Clara ate it all and meant every bite. She watched him with the children during supper. He was not the kind of father who performed fatherhood. He didn't make speeches or offer lessons. He just was there. He noticed when Eli's shoe was untied and reached under the table and fixed it mid-sentence while still listening to whatever Rose was saying about school. He cut Nate's meat without being asked, automatically, in the same motion as reaching for his own fork. He forgot to eat half of what was on his own plate because he was handling 3 different small emergencies simultaneously, and his food went cold and he ate it cold without comment. Margaret had been the center of this place, Clara thought, and when she left, the center didn't hold. But something else happened instead. The things didn't fall apart. They just redistributed. Garrett became both things at once, not well, not smoothly, but completely, entirely, with everything he had. It was the most honest thing she'd ever watched. After supper, Rose and Eli washed the dishes with the negotiated resentment of a long-running arrangement, and Garrett sat on the floor with Nate and a set of wooden blocks, while Clara sat in the chair near the stove and held her coffee cup and let herself just be still, which she had not been in weeks, possibly months, the kind of still that isn't emptiness, but rest. Nate looked at her over his father's shoulder, solemn, the way toddlers are solemn. Then he picked up a wooden block and held it out toward her across 3 feet of air, the way small children offer things, not expecting you to cross the distance, just making the gesture. "That's a real compliment," Garrett said without looking up. "He doesn't hand things to people." Clara leaned forward and took the block. Nate watched her with grave satisfaction. Then he went back to his building project. She held the block in her hand, small and worn smooth and painted red. A long time ago, and she thought, I am sitting in a house that isn't mine, with children that aren't mine, feeling something I don't have a careful name for, and I came here with $8 and a broken plan, and I should be thinking about Edwin Marsh and Denver and the practical shape of a survivable future. She thought about none of those things. She thought about how the fire sounded, and how the coffee was strong, and how Nate had chosen her to hand that block to out of everyone in the room. Walter Marsh made his move in December. He didn't do it subtly, and he didn't do it unkindly, which almost made it worse. He came to find her on a Saturday at the end of her shift, waiting outside the laundry, hat in hand, the senior Marsh, not the nephew. And he spoke with the directness of a man who runs a company and has learned that time is the one thing you can't buy back. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "I'll come straight to it. Edwin likes you, more than I've seen him take to anyone, and I know your situation here is not comfortable." He held up one hand before she could speak. "I'm not making assumptions. I'm making an offer. Edwin has a position, a house, a future. He'd treat you well. I'd stake a good deal on that." Clara stood in the cold outside the laundry with her coat buttoned to the throat and her hands still chapped from the day's work, and she looked at Walter Marsh. Decent man, she believed, genuinely well-meaning, not a Harold Briggs, and she said, "I believe you, and I'm grateful for your regard." She chose her words slowly. "But I'm not available, Mr. Marsh." Walter Marsh blinked. "I wasn't aware. Neither was I," she said, "until just now." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, with the slight air of a man acknowledging a decision he doesn't entirely understand but recognizes as final. "I see," he said. He put his hat back on. He walked away. Clara stood very still in the cold for a moment after he rounded the corner. "Neither was I, until just now." She'd said it before she meant to, and then heard herself say it and understood it was true. She was not available. She walked back through the main street of Silver Creek in the early December cold, past the general store and the bank, and the spot where the hotel porch was now mostly empty in the winter chill. And she thought about a man who ate his supper cold because he was busy being present, and a boy who handed her a wooden block, and a girl who shared her mother's saying with someone who didn't already know it. She thought about Garrett Rowan, who had offered her apples and squash and Sunday supper and nothing else, no pressure and no promises. Just a steady and undemanding presence that somehow said more than Edwin Marsh's rehearsed effortlessness ever could. She was not available. The realization sat in her chest, warm and terrifying in equal measure. She didn't go back to the ranch for 2 weeks after that. Not because she was avoiding it, or not only because of that. Agnes had taken sick in early December, and Clara had covered extra shifts, 6 days straight of full days, and by the time Agnes was back on her feet, Clara had earned enough to pay 2 months ahead on the boarding house room and buy herself a wool coat that actually closed properly against the cold. Small victories, real ones. But she was also, if she was being honest, a little frightened of what she'd said out loud to Walter Marsh, and what it meant about the direction of her own heart, which had not asked her permission before going where it went. Garrett sent Eli into town with a message on the 10th day. Not a letter, just Eli, appearing at the laundry door during the noon break with a look of exaggerated casualness that convinced no one. "Pa wanted to know if you were well," Eli said, "since you hadn't come by." "I'm well," Clara said. "I've been working extra. Tell him I'm well." Eli looked at her with those 2 old eyes. "He's been fixing the gate," he said. "The front one. That was broken." Clara looked at him carefully. "Is that so?" "And the south fence post." Eli scuffed one boot against the other. "And he rehung the kitchen window that's been sticking since summer." A pause. "He's been fixing things." Clara said nothing for a moment. Then, "Tell him I'll come Sunday." Eli's face did the lighting up thing again. "I'll tell him." He turned to go, then looked back. "He'll probably act like it doesn't matter," he said helpfully. "But it will." He left. Clara stood in the doorway of the laundry and watched him go up the street and felt something move through her that was partly warmth and partly something sharp and genuine that hurt in the way that only good things hurt when you've been without them long enough. She came on Sunday. The gate opened without protest. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. Garrett met her at the porch. Not the bottom step this time, but the porch itself, which was a difference she registered without making anything of it out loud. Nate was on his hip, bundled in wool, looking at Clara with the earnest evaluation of a very small scientist. Rose was behind Garrett with a dish towel in her hands and flour on her sleeve. "We made biscuits," Rose announced. "I did the measuring. Eli added too much salt on purpose." Did not, Eli called from inside. Did so. They're probably fine, Garrett said, with the tone of a man who genuinely isn't sure but is choosing optimism. They were not entirely fine. They were slightly too salty, and one of them had a dark bottom that said the oven had been running hot. Clara ate two of them and told Rose they were good, which was not completely a lie because she'd meant good for something. Eli salted on purpose, and on those terms, they absolutely were. At the table, between Eli's commentary and Nate's determined rearrangement of his food, Garrett looked at her once across the plates and the ordinary mess of the meal and said nothing, just looked. And she looked back, and something passed between them that was not words and did not need to be. And Eli knocked his water glass over again, and the moment folded back into the noise of the evening. But it had been there. Both of them knew it. After the children were in bed, a process that took 40 minutes and involved two disputes about blanket distribution and one small person's crisis about a missing toy horse that turned out to be under the bed, Garrett came back to the main room and found Clara washing the supper dishes. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I know," she said, and kept washing. He stood beside her after a moment and dried. They worked through the stack in silence, the kind of silence that isn't absence but presence, two people occupying the same space without needing to fill it. And when the last plate was done, Clara set down the washcloth and turned. "Walter Marsh came to see me," she said. Garrett went still. "I heard." Of course he had. 400 people. "I said no," she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at the stack of clean plates with the expression of a man thinking something through carefully. "Edwin Marsh could give you things," he said finally. "Things you'd be a fool not to want." "Maybe," she said. "I have 3 children and more debt than I talk about and a north pasture that floods every spring." He said it evenly, not self-pityingly, just with the flatness of an honest accounting. "I'm not a man who should be telling someone what to choose." "No," she agreed. "You're not." He looked up at her. "But you could be the man who tells me what you want," she said. The silence after that was a different kind. Longer. The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the December wind found the gap under the door it always found. Garrett looked at her for a long time, long enough that she thought he was going to say nothing, was going to retreat behind the quiet strength he wore like a second coat, and she was already deciding how she'd make her graceful exit. Then he said, "I want you to keep coming on Sundays." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was an honest, imperfect, incomplete thing said by a man who had learned the hard way to be careful with what he asked for. Clara looked at him, at the tired lines around his eyes, and the flour that was somehow on his collar, from the biscuits Rose made, and the way he stood like a man who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that he doesn't notice it anymore. "All right," she said. And that was enough. For now, that was entirely enough. She put on her coat, and he walked her to the door, and she went out into the cold December night with the gate swinging easy behind her, and she didn't look back. But she was smiling before she reached the road, and she didn't try to stop herself. She walked the 1.5 miles back to town in the dark and cold, and her breath made clouds in the air, and somewhere above the mountains, the stars were doing what they always did, indifferent and ancient and impossibly far away, and Clara Whitlock, who had arrived in Silver Creek with $8 and a broken plan and nothing else, thought, "This is what forward feels like. I had forgotten." She walked faster. January came in hard, the kind of hard that Silver Creek people talked about for years afterward. 3 feet of snow in the first week, then a freeze that locked everything under a crust of ice so thick the horses slipped on the main street and 2 wagons lost wheels to the ruts. The laundry ran day and night because half the town's pipes had frozen, and Agnes Tully, recovered from her illness but moving slower than before, had taken on 3 extra contracts from hotels that couldn't manage their own linen. Clara worked 6 days straight again, which was familiar territory by now, and she didn't complain because complaining was a luxury, and she still hadn't fully recalibrated to the idea of luxuries. The Sunday visits continued. Not every Sunday, twice. The snow made the road impassable, and she stayed in town, but most of them, and they had taken on the quality of something established, a rhythm. Garrett never mentioned it during the week, and she never mentioned it either, but by Saturday evening she was always aware of the morning coming, the way you become aware of something you'd rather not admit you're looking forward to. She brought things sometimes. Nothing extravagant. A jar of preserves she'd put up with fruit Agnes gave her from the cellar. A book of arithmetic tables she'd found at the general store, reduced to a nickel, because Rose had mentioned that the school's copies were worn through. Once, a small tin horse for Nate that she'd found at the bottom of a barrel of goods at the trading post, dented, missing one ear, 2 cents, and he'd carried it for the rest of the day with both hands like it was made of something precious. Garrett watched her bring these things and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of statement. But January also brought Harold Briggs. She'd managed, through a combination of route planning and strategic shopping hours, to avoid meaningful contact with Harold Briggs since the morning of the envelope. She'd seen him plenty. Silver Creek was not big enough for genuine avoidance. But seeing and speaking were different things, and she had kept them different through effort. Briggs was the kind of man who mistook absence for forgiveness, and interpreted her silence as acceptance of the way things had gone, which was incorrect, but she had neither the time nor the energy to correct him. She should have known January would close that distance. He came into the laundry on a Thursday morning when Agnes was out on a supply errand and Clara was alone behind the counter. He came in with a bundle of shirts in a manner that suggested he'd timed it. "Miss Whitlock," he said, setting the shirts on the counter with a kind of proprietary ease, like he was leaving them at his own kitchen. "I've been meaning to speak with you." "Shirts back Saturday," she said. She did not look up from the ledger she was entering. "I heard you turned down Edwin Marsh." She looked up then. Not because she was surprised, 400 people, she knew the calculation, but because she wanted to look him in the face when she answered. "That's between Edwin Marsh and me. It's between you and your good sense, is what it is." He said it without particular malice, which was somehow worse than if he'd been nasty about it. He sounded concerned. He sounded like a man performing concern so well he'd convinced himself it was real. "The Marsh family has standing in this county, Miss Whitlock. A woman in your position. My position," she repeated. "Alone, no family, working in a laundry." He spread his hands. "I'm not saying anything cruel. I'm saying the practical truth." Clara put the pen down. She did it carefully because what she wanted to do with it was not careful. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "you put a bill of debt on a table in front of a woman whose uncle had just died, in a room full of people who watched, and you told me I needed a husband. That was the first thing you said to me in Silver Creek." She kept her voice even. She'd practiced even. "I've thought about that conversation several times. I keep coming to the same conclusion, which is that what you call the practical truth and what is actually true are two different things." She picked up the ledger. "Your shirts will be ready Saturday." He left. He wasn't angry. That was the thing that stayed with her after. He left without anger, which meant he hadn't heard her at all, had categorized her words as the emotional response of a woman who didn't understand her own situation, and had already started constructing his next approach. She knew that look. She'd seen it on men her whole life, the way they listen to women the way you listen to weather, aware of it, waiting for it to pass, not engaging with it as an argument. She entered 3 more items in the ledger without absorbing a single one of them. The thing about Garrett Rowan that she had not expected, had not been able to predict from the outside from the brief encounters and the careful distances, was that he was funny. Not performance funny. Not the practiced social humor of a man at a dinner table managing a room. It was the kind of funny that comes out sideways when you're not expecting it, in the middle of ordinary sentences, in the gap between one thing and the next. He said dry, unexpected things that made her laugh before she'd decided to, and then he'd continue on with whatever he was doing without acknowledging the laugh, as though it was a private transaction between her and the humor that he'd had no part in. She learned this slowly, the way you learn things about people that they don't perform for you, through repetition and proximity and enough Sunday evenings to add up to a real picture. He was also, she learned, carrying something he hadn't told her about. She figured it out not from anything he said, but from the quality of his silences. They were comfortable silences. They'd established those, the kind that existed while they washed dishes or sat near the stove after the children were down. And then there was a different kind, a weight-bearing silence, that appeared occasionally and without warning when she said certain things or asked questions that ran close to certain subjects. The subject, she understood eventually, was the ranch, the money. Not the general acknowledged difficulty of running a ranch alone with 3 children, but something specific and worse than that. She didn't push. She'd been pushed at enough in her own life to know what it felt like, and she wasn't going to be the kind of person who did that to someone else. She filed the observation away and waited. The answer came in February, not from Garrett, but from Pearl Hensley at the general store, who had the small-town archivist's impulse to share what she knew with people she'd decided to like. "The Rowan Ranch has a banknote on it," Pearl said, with the careful delicacy of someone passing something fragile. "Garrett took it out 3 years ago when Margaret was sick. The treatments were expensive." A pause, the kind that contains an entire history. "He's been paying it down, but it's a heavy burden. The note comes due in full in April." Pearl put 3 tins on the counter and looked at Clara with the expression of someone who has said what they meant to say and is now letting it land. "I mention it because you're friendly with them, and I thought you should know the whole picture." Clara paid for her goods and walked back to the boarding house and sat at her small table and held the information in her hands the way she'd held Garrett's apples in September, carefully, as something real and weighty. Margaret had been sick. He'd borrowed against the ranch to save her, and then lost her anyway. She pressed her knuckles against her mouth and sat with that for a while. There are moments when you understand something about a person that reorganizes everything else you know about them. Not because it changes what you thought, but because it completes it. The cold suppers and the tightness around his eyes and the way he moved through the ranch like he was running a calculation in his head constantly, the fence posts and the gate and the kitchen window he'd quietly repaired. She understood now that he was a man doing the arithmetic of survival while simultaneously fighting not to let it show to his children. The cost of that, the daily cost, the exhausting performance of steadiness for 3 young people who needed him to be steady. She understood it in her chest, not just her head. She went on Sunday and she didn't say anything about what Pearl had told her, but she brought bread. 2 full loaves she'd baked in Agnes's kitchen the night before, real bread, the kind that takes time, and she set them on the Rowan table and watched Eli's face do the thing it did. And she helped Rose with the arithmetic problem she'd been stuck on for a week. And after supper, she sat on the floor with Nate and the dented tin horse and the wooden blocks, and she built him the most structurally improbable tower she could manage, while he knocked it down and laughed the full-body laugh of toddlers who have found something genuinely perfect. Garrett watched all of this from the doorway with his arms folded and an expression she'd learned to read. The ones that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite pain and was actually both at the same time. Edwin Marsh made one more attempt in February. She gave him credit. It wasn't clumsy. He caught her coming out of the general store on a Tuesday and fell into step beside her as naturally as if they'd been walking together all afternoon, and he made conversation that was genuine and light and carefully without pressure. And at the end of 2 blocks he said, "I know you said no in October. I'm not rescinding the door. I just want you to know it's still there." Clara stopped walking. She looked at him directly. She always looked directly. It was a habit she'd developed in Cincinnati working for a solicitor who respected directness above everything. And she said, "Edwin, you are a genuinely decent man, and I think you'll make someone very happy." He smiled, a little ruefully. "But not you." "Not me?" He nodded. He actually seemed to absorb it this time, which she respected. "Is it Rowan?" he asked. Not aggressively, with what seemed like genuine curiosity. She considered lying. Then, "I don't entirely know what it is yet. But yes, in some way I haven't fully named." Edwin was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's a good man. Carries too much, but a good man." He tipped his hat. "I hope it works out for you, Miss Whitlock. I mean that." He turned and walked the other direction, and she watched him go with a complicated feeling that contained both relief and something like genuine sadness on his behalf. He'd been a real option, a real, concrete, comfortable option. She'd chosen something uncertain over something safe, and that choice still scared her when she looked at it directly. She went home and lay on her narrow boarding house bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about April. A banknote coming due in full. A ranch with a flooded north pasture. 3 children who needed things children need that cost money. A man eating cold suppers because he was too busy being everything to everyone to sit down while his food was still warm. She thought, "I have nothing. What could I possibly offer?" Then she thought, "He's not asking you for money." Then she thought, "He hasn't asked you for anything at all," which was the problem. Which was, specifically and precisely, the problem. Because Garrett Rowan was the kind of man who would carry everything alone until it broke him before he'd ask for anything. And she recognized that because she'd been doing a version of the same thing since September, and two people drowning in separate directions wasn't a plan. She sat up. She thought about what she was actually good at. Not abstractly, not as a list, but concretely. She could run accounts. She'd done the solicitor's books in Cincinnati for 2 years. She could organize, manage, plan, stretch a dollar further than it should stretch. She could cook, properly, not adequately. She could sew well enough to handle anything the household needed. She knew numbers. She liked numbers. Numbers didn't change the rules on you without warning. She thought about the laundry's ledger, which she'd taken over from Agnes 3 weeks ago, when Agnes's eyesight started giving her trouble with the close columns, and how Agnes had looked at her first reconciliation and said simply, in the tone of someone who has been doing things a harder way than necessary. She wasn't nothing. She hadn't been nothing on the day she arrived in Silver Creek with $8, but she'd been too frightened and too bruised to see herself clearly. She was less frightened now. She could see better. March came. The snow began to loosen its grip, not giving up. The cold didn't give up anything in Colorado, it negotiated. But the edges started to go soft during the warmest part of the afternoon, and the light changed quality in the way that March light does, coming in at a different angle, not warm yet, but promising warmth. She was at the ranch on a Sunday in mid-March when it happened. The children were in bed early. Nate had been running a low fever for 2 days, nothing dangerous but enough to exhaust him, and he'd gone down before dark. Rose and Eli, unusually cooperative in the face of the baby's suffering, had followed without the usual negotiation. Clara and Garrett were at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee gone cold between them, and he had a ledger open in front of him that he'd been staring at for 20 minutes without writing anything in it, and she'd been watching him stare at it. "You don't have to pretend it's not there," she said. He looked up. "What?" "Whatever's in that ledger. You've been staring at it like it owes you something." He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He turned it around and pushed it across the table to her. She looked at the columns. She didn't say anything for a while. She took the numbers in the way she took in numbers, letting them build a picture rather than reacting to each one individually. The picture was not good. Not catastrophic, not yet, but not good. "April," she said. "April 15th, he confirmed. "How short?" $230. She sat with that. $230 was not an insurmountable number in the abstract. On a good year with a good harvest and no emergencies, it was achievable. But this had not been a good year. The flooding, the fence repairs, Nate's doctor twice in December, the forge bill from when the plow cracked and had to be recast. "I've been talking to Briggs about an extension," Garrett said. His voice was flat in the particular way of men who've had humiliating conversations and are reporting them as fact without showing what they cost. "He's not enthusiastic." "Briggs doesn't do enthusiastic," Clara said. "He said he'd consider it if I put up the south field as additional collateral." Garrett's jaw moved. "The south field is where the children— Margaret had a kitchen garden there. It's where—" He stopped. "It's where we buried the cat last spring. Eli cried for a week." He said this last thing quietly, like it was the detail that made the whole thing real and unbearable in a way the numbers couldn't. Clara looked at him. At the line of his shoulders, which were doing the carrying thing, she could see it, physically, the weight expressed in posture. "Can I look at this more carefully?" she said. "The ledger. Can I take it home and work through it?" "It's not your problem." "I know it's not," she said. "I'm asking if I can help." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire made its sounds. Somewhere upstairs, Nate coughed once and went quiet. "You've got your own," he started. "Garrett." She said his name the way he sometimes said hers. Plain, without decoration, cutting through. "Let me look at it." He closed the ledger and slid it across to her without another word. She walked home that night with the ledger under her arm and Garrett's accounts in her head, and something else taking shape that she hadn't entirely planned, but that felt, in the particular way of decisions that are already made before you recognize them, inevitable. She sat at her small table with the lamp turned up as high as it would go, and she went through every column. It took 3 hours. She made notes in the margins in her own small, precise handwriting. She ran the numbers 4 different ways, looking for what she'd suspected. That the ledger was technically accurate but organizationally muddled, Expenses mixed with projections mixed with old debts that had already been paid but never struck. The bookkeeping of a man who kept it himself between everything else and sometimes lost a week to weather or sick children and then reconstructed from memory. When she was done, the picture was still not good. But it was better than the ledger suggested. There was room, not much, but room, to restructure, to pay some things in a different order, to negotiate one outstanding bill with the feed merchant who had, she knew from Agnes, a standing practice of deferring to accounts in good standing. The gap was still real, but it was closer to $160 than $230 if she played it right. She set down her pen. She thought, and if I had income beyond the laundry? She thought about it for a long time. She thought about what Agnes had said, unprompted, 2 weeks ago, setting down a mug of coffee with the directness of a woman who'd earned the right to say whatever she meant. I'm not getting younger, Clara, and I'm not getting more eyes. A pause. I want you to consider a partnership, not wages, a stake. Agnes had walked away before Clara could answer, which was Agnes's way of giving someone time to think without making them respond in the moment. Clara had been thinking ever since. A stake in the laundry, steady income, not wages that could be cut, but a share of what it earned. She sat with the two things side by side, the laundry stake and the ranch ledger. And she understood that they were not two problems. They were one problem, and she was sitting at the center of it with a pen and a lamp and the specific, terrifying clarity that comes at 2 a.m. when there's nothing left to hide behind. She was in love with Garrett Rowan. She'd been in love with him since some point she couldn't precisely identify, probably somewhere around the cold supper and the tin horse, and she had been handling it carefully, carrying it at a distance, treating it like something delicate that might break if she looked at it directly. She was looking at it directly now. She was also practical enough to understand that love was not a banknote. April 15th didn't care about love. The conversation happened on a Wednesday. She brought the ledger back herself instead of waiting for Sunday. She walked out to the ranch in the afternoon. Agnes had let her leave at midday without asking why, with the particular perception of a woman who sees most things and picks her moments. And she found Garrett in the barn repairing harness leather with the focused attention of a man doing the one task that's keeping him from thinking about something worse. He looked up when she came in. He saw the ledger. "What did you find?" he said. She sat down on a bale across from him and laid the ledger open on the hay bale between them and showed him what she'd found, line by line. Not rushing it, not making him feel stupid for how it had been organized, just showing him what was there. He listened with his full attention, the way he did things. And when she was done, he sat back and looked at the reworked numbers for a long time. 160, he said, around that, if Hennings defers the feed bill to May. He might. He rubbed his face with one hand. He's done it before. A long silence. That's still $160 I don't have. I know. Clara. Agnes Tully offered me a partnership, she said. A stake in the laundry. It would change my income. She watched his face. I want to invest in the ranch. The silence that followed was a different animal entirely. He set the harness down. No, he said. Hear me out. That's your security, he said. His voice was careful in the way voices get when they're managing something strong. That's the first solid ground you've had since you got here. You're not taking anything. I'm offering. There's a difference. She said it back to him, his own words from the root cellar in November, and she saw from his face that he recognized them. He stood up. I wasn't angry. She could tell the difference between Garrett angry and Garrett afraid, and this was afraid. The specific fear of someone who has already lost something they didn't protect well enough. That's not the kind of thing. He stopped, started over. Clara, that's the kind of thing a wife does. You understand that? Not a Sunday visitor, not a woman who's here because my son talked to her on a hotel porch. The word wife sat between them in the cold barn air. She looked at him. He looked at her. He was standing with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man who has just said something true and is not sure whether it helped or made everything worse. And she understood that he hadn't planned to say it, that it had come out of whatever place in him was tired of being careful, and he was now waiting for her to tell him what she thought it meant. Is that what you want? She said. Plainly. Not the ranch, not the money, not because it makes sense. Is it what you want? The barn was very quiet. It's what I've wanted, he said, since longer ago than I knew how to say. He looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man confessing something that cost him. You came, and you didn't fix things. You didn't try to. You just were there. And my kids started. Rose laughs again. Eli has someone to tell things to. Nate, he stopped. His jaw worked. Nate calls you Ka. Did you know that? He doesn't have your whole name yet, but he's been saying Ka for 3 weeks, and I haven't told you because I didn't know how to say it without saying everything else. Clara sat very still. He calls you that when you're not there, Garrett said. He goes to the door sometimes and says it, like he's asking where you went. She breathed through that, slowly. I can't promise you easy, he said. I can't promise you anything except that I will show up, every day, whatever it costs. He looked at her then, directly, with the full weight of someone who has stopped managing their face. But I am not a man who should be asking a woman to take on what I'm carrying. You didn't ask, she said. I'm telling you. She stood up. The hay bale between them was not a significant distance. She crossed it. I didn't come to Silver Creek to find an easy life, Garrett. I came here because I was out of other options, and a dead man's letter was the only thing pointing anywhere. And then his son talked to me on a porch, and his daughter shared her mother's words with me, and his baby handed me a block across 3 feet of air. She stopped. I don't want Edwin Marsh's house in Denver. I want the gate that opens easy now because you fixed it. I want the Sunday suppers that are never quite right. I want Rose's 2 salty biscuits and Eli's running commentary and Nate saying Ka at a door. She held his gaze. I want you. The whole complicated, debt-carrying, cold supper-eating version. Not instead of something better, instead of something easier. He looked at her for a long time after that. The kind of looking that isn't about seeing something new, but about finally letting yourself believe what's already in front of you. I have 3 children, he said. I know. And a flooded north pasture. I know. And a banknote due in April. I'm working on that, she said. If you'll let me. Something moved through his face. Not a smile, not yet, but the thing that happens before a smile in a person who's forgotten how. The first loosening of something long held. He stopped, tried again. You're the most stubborn woman I have ever met. Coming from a man who ate a cold supper for 2 years rather than ask anyone for help, she said, that's a real statement. He made the sound, the not quite laugh, not quite sigh she'd heard before. And this time it tipped all the way over into something that was actually, genuinely, laughter. Real laughter, the kind that comes out against your will, and she saw in it who he must have been before, easier, less guarded, with more of himself available to the surface. It lasted only a few seconds. Then it settled back into him, but different, lighter somehow, as though some ballast had shifted. He reached out and took her hand and held it, and did not let go. All right, he said. The same word she'd given him in December, standing in his kitchen after the dishes. He gave it back to her now the same way she'd given it, simply, completely, without conditions. Outside the barn, the March afternoon was making its argument for spring. The snow on the south roof was dripping in a steady, quiet rhythm. Somewhere in the house, she could hear Nate moving around, his particular toddler sound, half shuffle, half stomp, and the low murmur of Rose's voice talking to him, and Eli's added in, the 3 of them up there in the ordinary noise of being alive. Garrett held her hand and didn't say anything else, and neither did she, and it was the most honest silence she'd stood inside since she could remember. They did not tell the children right away, not because they were hiding it. There was nothing shameful to hide, and Garrett was not a man who operated in half-truths with his own kids, but because the thing between them was still new enough to be careful with, still finding its shape, and both of them understood without discussing it that some things need a little time before they can survive being named out loud. What changed immediately was the practical. Clara accepted Agnes's partnership offer the following Monday, signing her name to the arrangement in Agnes's cramped back office, while Agnes watched with the expression of someone closing a deal they've been patient about for longer than they let on. The stake was modest, 30%, built from the wages she'd been partially deferring since December at Agnes's quiet suggestion, a suggestion Clara had taken without fully understanding at the time what Agnes was building toward. It wasn't wealth. It was the difference between survivable and stable, which was its own category of relief. She walked out of the laundry that Monday afternoon, a part owner of something, and stood on the wooden sidewalk in the March cold and let that settle through her for a moment before she went back inside to finish the afternoon's work. The banknote was the next problem. She'd spent 3 evenings with the reworked ledger, running different arrangements of the numbers, and the gap had narrowed to somewhere between 150 and 160, depending on whether Garrett could sell 2 of the older horses before April. Horses she'd seen, solid animals that had aged past their best working years, and she'd mentioned quietly that the Hendersons out on the East Road were expanding and had been asking around about draft stock. Garrett had looked at her sideways when she said that, the look he gave her when she produced information he didn't know she had, which happened more often now, and then simply nodded and said he'd speak to Henderson. He spoke to Henderson. The horses sold. The gap became $80. It was still $80 they didn't have. She went to Harold Briggs herself. She didn't tell Garrett she was going. She knew he'd argue, would want to come, would feel the particular injury of a man who believes it's his problem to carry and his conversation to have. She understood that feeling, and she also understood that Garrett, in that office, with his history with Briggs and the weight of what the loan represented, 2 years of fighting to save Margaret, 2 years of losing anyway, the whole terrible arithmetic of love against illness, would not produce the best outcome. So she went on a Tuesday morning before the laundry opened, and she sat across from Harold Briggs's desk, and she put the reworked ledger on the table. Briggs looked at it. He looked at her. He leaned back in his chair with the particular posture of a man deciding how much of himself to reveal. "You did this?" he said. "I did." "Where'd you learn accounts?" 2 years with a solicitor in Cincinnati. She kept her voice level. "Mr. Hennings has agreed to defer the feed bill to May. The 2 horses sold to Henderson last week. The ledger shows a restructured payment schedule that brings the note current without the Southfield as collateral." She watched him. "I'm asking you to accept it." Briggs turned a page, turned another. He had the face of a man who spends his professional life looking for the crack in things. And she let him look, because she'd built this so he wouldn't find one. "This doesn't close the full amount by April 15th, he said. "It closes all but $80 by April 15th and the remainder by June 1st. She folded her hands on the table. "The note allows for partial settlement with approval. It allows for it at my discretion." "Yes," she said, "which is why I'm here asking for your discretion." Briggs was quiet for a while. He turned one more page, then closed the ledger and set it back on the table and looked at her with the expression he'd had in the general store back in September, the one that Pearl Hensley had mentioned, the one about handling yourself well. She hadn't known then that he'd said it. She knew now. "I told Walter Marsh that Fletcher Whitlock's niece had a good head," he said. "I remember what you told me Fletcher Whitlock's niece needed," she said, "and I remember where you said it." A beat of silence. Something shifted in his face. Not shame, exactly. Something adjacent. "The Southfield stays with Rowan," he said. He picked up a pen. "I'll note the revised schedule." She walked out of the Silver Creek Savings and Loan in March the way she hadn't been able to walk out of it in September, with the things she'd come for. She told Garrett that evening. She rode out to the ranch. She'd been borrowing Agnes's horse on Tuesdays, an arrangement that Agnes had proposed and she'd accepted without ceremony, and she found him at the back fence doing the repair work that March made possible and April would require. She dismounted and walked to where he was working and told him what she'd done and what the result was. He went very still with his hands on the fence post and listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was how she knew he was managing something large. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a long moment. "You went to Briggs," he said. "Yes." "Without telling me?" "Yes." She met his eyes directly. "Because you would have argued about it, and I didn't have time for the argument." He looked at her. The expression on his face was complicated in the way of a man who has been handled skillfully and knows it and isn't entirely sure how he feels about it. "Clara, the Southfield is yours," she said. "Margaret's kitchen garden is yours. That's what matters." Something crossed his face when she said Margaret's name, the thing it always did, the brief tightening that she'd learned not to look away from, not to pretend she didn't see. He turned back to the fence post. "I should have managed the books better," he said. "You were managing 3 children and a flooded pasture and a sick baby and everything else." Still. "Garrett." She waited until he looked at her. You kept everything alive. Every single thing on this ranch kept breathing because of you. The books were the last thing on the list and they stayed last. And that's not failure. That's triage. She held his gaze. I'm good at accounts. You're good at everything else. That's not a deficit. That's two people having different skills. He held her gaze for a long time. Then he picked up the fence post and set it into the ground with the kind of deliberate physical action men use when they need to do something with a feeling they don't know what else to do with. I don't know how to be helped, he said. Not to her, to the fence post mostly. I've been the one doing the helping for so long I don't know the other direction. I know, she said. I've noticed. He drove the post in, stood back, looked at it. You're going to have to be patient with me. I'm aware. I mean it. I'll do it wrong. I'll try to carry things alone because it's habit. I'll forget to say things. Margaret used to say I communicated like a man who'd taken a vow of silence. Clara felt the smile before she could manage it. She wasn't wrong. He made the sound, the one that was a laugh happening against his will. And this time it came with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough. No, she wasn't. They stood at the back fence in the March afternoon light, the kind of light that couldn't decide if it was still winter, and the ranch was quiet around them in the way of a place that was holding its breath. I'd like to tell the children, he said. Soon. When you're ready. I'm ready now, he said. I'm just not sure how to say it. Start with Eli, she said. He already knows. She was right about Eli. They told him first, separately from the others, sitting with him at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon while Rose was at the neighbor's and Nate was sleeping. Garrett had planned something. She could see him reaching for it, the way he reached for things when he was going to say something important, and then apparently abandoned the plan and just said it plainly. Clara and I are going to get married, in the spring. Eli looked at his father, then at Clara, then back at his father. I know, he said. Garrett blinked. You know. Rose said so in December. Eli was already reaching for the biscuit at the edge of the table that had been sitting there since breakfast. She said you were fixing things because of Clara. She said that's what people do. Clara pressed her lips together hard. Garrett looked at the ceiling briefly with the expression of a man reassessing how much his children had been ahead of him. Rose said this in December. Eli took a bite of the biscuit. Can Clara's room be upstairs? Nate keeps going to the front door saying her name. It'd be easier if she was just here. Garrett looked at Clara. Clara looked at Garrett. We'll work out the rooms, Garrett said. Okay. Eli finished the biscuit. Are we having supper soon? I helped with the horses. That was Eli's complete reaction. Clara sat at the Rowan kitchen table and felt something in her chest that had been wound tight for months. Release another quarter turn. The boy had known since December. He'd watched his father fix things and understood it at 6 years old with a clarity that would have taken most adults years to arrive at. Rose was more complicated, not hostile. Rose had never been hostile, but she was careful in the way of children who have already been through one version of loss and have organized themselves around the possibility of another. Clara understood this. She'd thought about how to handle it and then thrown away every plan she'd made, because planned conversations with grieving children don't land the way real ones do. What happened instead was unplanned, and she thought later, exactly right. Rose came home from the neighbors to find Eli already at the table and Garrett making coffee, and Clara mending Nate's jacket at the chair near the stove. The chair that had become, over months of Sunday evenings, the chair people assumed she'd sit in. Rose looked at the scene the way she looked at everything, taking inventory, running the calculation. Then she looked at her father. Garrett nodded once. Rose turned to Clara. Her expression was the particular brand of 8-year-old seriousness that sat somewhere between adult and terrified. Are you going to change things? She asked. Clara stopped mending. She set down the jacket. What things? How things are. Rose's hands were clasped in front of her. The way the house is. The way things go. Clara thought about the right answer for a moment. Then she thought that the right answer was probably just the true one. Some things will change, she said. I'd be lying if I told you otherwise. But I'm not here to change the important things. Which are the important things? Your mama, Clara said, simply and directly. How you remember her. The stories you have. The things she said and the things she made and the places on this ranch. that are hers. She held Rose's eyes. I'm not her, and I'm not trying to be. There's no version of this where I replace her. She was here first, and she built what I'm walking into, and I'm not going to pretend that isn't true. Rose was quiet for a long moment. She had a kitchen garden, she said finally, behind the south cellar. It's been empty since she died. I know, Clara said. Your father mentioned it. I tried to plant it last spring, Rose said. I didn't know what I was doing. Nothing came up right. A pause. I couldn't ask Papa because he couldn't. He doesn't go near the south side much. Clara thought about Garrett and the south field and the banknote and what it had cost him. All of it. The whole interwoven weight of that piece of ground. Maybe we could try it together this spring, she said. You could tell me what she planted, and I could tell you what I know about soil, and between us we might get something to grow. Rose looked at her for a long time with those careful eyes. Then she said, she planted tomatoes along the east side because she said the morning sun was best for them. That's a good instinct, Clara said. She was right about the morning sun. Rose sat down at the table. She didn't say anything else right away, but she sat down, which was its own kind of statement. They were married on the first Saturday of April. Not a large wedding. Silver Creek had expectations about weddings. The church, the reception, the organized spectacle of a community witnessing something. But Clara and Garrett had talked about it once, briefly, and arrived at the same conclusion without much debate. Something simple. Something real. A few people who mattered. Agnes came, wearing a dress Clara had never seen before and refusing to be sentimental about it in any visible way. Pearl Hensley came with her husband, whose name turned out to be Gerald, and who spent most of the ceremony beaming at everyone with the uncomplicated happiness of a man who has been waiting for something good to happen in his vicinity. The minister was brief and practical, which suited them both. Eli stood very straight and serious in a clean shirt and combed hair, holding Nate's hand because Nate had shown a strong inclination toward wandering. Rose stood beside Clara and held the small bunch of early spring flowers they'd picked that morning from the place along the creek where things bloomed first, and she held them carefully, at the same angle Margaret had held flowers in the photograph on the parlor shelf. Clara noticed it later, looking at both images in her memory, and understood that Rose hadn't planned it, that it had come from somewhere unconscious and deep. When it was done, the words said, the rings exchanged, the moment arrived at that both of them had been circling since September without knowing it. Garrett looked at her with an expression that was not the sweeping romantic enormity of story and performance, but something quieter and more permanent. The look of a man acknowledging something real. You sure about this? He said, quietly, so only she could hear. I was sure in March, she said. I was probably sure in November. I was just working up to saying it. Me too, he said. Eli's voice from 3 feet away. Can we eat now? I've been standing still for a long time. The first week of marriage was not the soft-edged beginning of something new. It was the practical collision of two lives that had each developed their own habits and methods and arrangements. And it was harder than Clara had expected in some ways, and easier than she'd feared in others. The harder part was space. Not emotional space, not the difficult geography of learning to be close to someone, but literal space. The Rowan house had 3 bedrooms and 4 people already in them, and the arrangement that got worked out was imperfect and involved Eli and Nate sharing a room with a specific dividing line down the middle of it that Eli had marked with a piece of string tied to the bedpost, and Rose getting her own room slightly larger than it had been because some of the storage was reorganized, and Clara moving into the main bedroom with Garrett and her travel bag, and the small accumulation of belongings she'd gathered in 7 months in Silver Creek. She unpacked her bag into the dresser that had been Margaret's dresser, and was now still Margaret's, she thought, and also hers, and those things didn't cancel each other out. She sat on the edge of the bed that first night, and Garrett came in from checking on the children and looked at her sitting there, and she looked at him, and there was a beat where they were both just 2 adults alone with the reality of what they'd done. It's strange, she said, not apologetically, just naming it. Yeah, he said. He sat down beside her. The bed was not new. It had the give of something old, something used. Does that bother you? No, she said, honestly. Strange doesn't bother me. I came here with $8 and a dead man's letter. I've recalibrated what bothers me. He made the sound that was a laugh. Fair. They sat there for a while in the not uncomfortable strangeness, And then he said, "Margaret's things are in the chest at the bottom. I didn't know what to do with them. Still don't. They're the kids." "They should stay where they are," Clara said. "When the kids are older, they'll want them." "I thought maybe you'd want me to." "No," she said. "Leave them." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You said that fast." "I've been thinking about it for a while," she said. "She doesn't disappear because you move her things. She doesn't disappear because I'm here. She's in Rose's face every time Rose reads something she loves. She's in Eli's." She stopped. "That laugh he has, the way it comes out all at once, is that hers?" Garrett looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "That's hers." "Then she's not going anywhere." Clara looked at the chest at the foot of the bed. "I'm not interested in a version of this family that pretends she didn't exist. I'm interested in the real version." He didn't say anything for a while. Then, with the careful steadiness of a man handling something fragile, "She would have liked you." Clara let that settle through her without trying to manage it or diminish it or redirect it. "I hope so," she said. "I know so." He said it with the quiet certainty of a man who knew the person he was speaking about well enough to be sure. "You're both too stubborn to not respect each other." Clara laughed. A real one, surprised out of her. "That is possibly the strangest compliment I've ever received." "I meant it as one." "I know you did." Hotem. April brought Briggs and the banknote and the final accounting. The $80 was the last and most concrete obstacle, and in the end it resolved in a way Clara hadn't predicted, and Garrett would have been too proud to engineer on his own. Walter Marsh came to the laundry on the second Monday of April. Not Edwin, Walter himself, with the air of a man doing something deliberate. And he put a folded note on the counter. "For Miss Whitlock," he said. "Mrs. Rowan now, I hear." She opened it. It was a draft for $80, drawn on the Marsh lumber account. "Mr. Marsh," she said. "My nephew liked you," Walter Marsh said, straightening his hat. "And I liked you better, if I'm honest, for turning him down the way you did. Took nerve." He looked at her with the direct gaze of a man who has lived long enough to know what he's looking at. "Call it a wedding gift." "That's extremely generous," she said. "I can't." "You can," he said. "It's not charity. Think of it as a man of business recognizing a good investment in the county's future." He turned to go. At the door he stopped. "Agnes Tully is lucky to have you as a partner. I intend to move our account here." He left before she could respond. Agnes appeared from the back room. "I've been waiting for that man to do something right," she said, "for about 6 years." They paid the banknote on April 15th, 3 hours before the deadline. Clara stood outside the savings and loan with the receipt in her hand and felt the particular sensation of a number disappearing from the running calculation in her head. That constant arithmetic of survival that had been with her since September. The dollars against necessities accounting that had run underneath everything like a second heartbeat. The note was gone. The south field was safe. The kitchen garden was where it had always been. She folded the receipt and put it in her coat pocket and walked back to the laundry. Spring came fully in May, the kind that apologizes for everything winter did by overdoing it in the other direction. Everything blooming at once, the mud turning back into actual ground, the light staying long enough in the evenings to feel like a different season entirely. The kitchen garden became the project of May. It was Rose who drove it, once she'd started, with the specific determination of someone reclaiming something that had been left unfinished. She'd brought out her mother's seed tin. Clara hadn't known there was a seed tin until Rose appeared with it one Saturday morning, a flat tobacco tin with Margaret's handwriting on the inside of the lid, a list of what went where and when. Clara had held it and looked at the handwriting, round, confident, a woman who wrote like she meant it, and said nothing for a moment. "She always started the tomatoes inside in March," Rose said, looking over her shoulder. "We're late." "We can catch up," Clara said. "Tomatoes are forgiving if you water them right." "Are they really?" "No," Clara said. "But let's try anyway." Rose looked at her for a moment. Then she did something she hadn't done before in Clara's presence. She laughed. Small, sudden. A laugh that had the quality of something that had been waiting to come out. "Okay," she said. "Let's try anyway." They worked the south garden through 2 Saturdays, Clara and Rose, with Eli appearing periodically to offer opinions nobody had asked for, and Garrett staying clear of that part of the yard in the way he'd done since Margaret died, but occasionally drifting closer, finding reasons to be at the fence near the south side. never quite crossing into the garden itself. On the second Saturday, he crossed it. He came at mid-afternoon with 2 cups of water, one for Clara and one for Rose, and he stood at the edge of the turned earth with the particular stillness of a man standing somewhere he hasn't been in a long time, and he looked at what was growing there, the early green beginnings of things just coming up, and he didn't say anything. Rose was watching him from where she was kneeling in the dirt. Clara was watching him too, but less obviously. He crouched down near the east row and looked at the tomato starts they'd put in. She always did these along the east side, he said. I know, Rose said. I told Clara. He stayed crouched there for a moment. His hand went to the soil near the base of one of the small plants, not touching the plant, just the dirt around it. Then he stood. Looks good, he said, and he walked back toward the barn. Clara looked at Rose. Rose looked back at Clara with the expression of a girl who has just watched her father do something she's been hoping for 2 years. He used to help her, Rose said quietly, in the garden, every year. I know, Clara said, though she hadn't known that specifically. She'd just known from the way he stood there. Do you think he'll come back? Rose asked. I think he'll find his way, Clara said. People usually do. It just takes them their own amount of time. Rose turned back to her planting. After a moment, she said, Mama's saying about the tired days. Yes? I thought about it a lot after she died. Rose pressed dirt carefully around a seedling with both hands. I think tired days feel bad on the outside, but they're growing days on the inside. That's what she meant. She looked up. Do you think that's right? Clara held the girl's gaze. She had turned 8 in February, and in 2 years she had been growing in the particular way of children who survive things, sideways, unexpected, strange new strength in strange new places. Yeah, Clara said. I think that's exactly right. Well, June settled over Silver Creek the way good things settle, quietly, without announcement, just there one day when you look up. The laundry was the best it had run, Agnes said, with the tone of someone not entirely comfortable with enthusiasm. The partnership had reorganized the accounts and negotiated 2 new hotel contracts and found a better arrangement with the linen supplier in Denver, and Agnes had said once and only once, looking at the books, good, which from Agnes was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else. The ranch was not transformed. It was not the sudden blooming of a neglected place into something cinematic and complete. The north pasture still flooded when the spring runoff was heavy. It always would. That was topography, not negligence. The front gate, now swinging easy, had been replaced by a fence post cracking in a different spot because that was how ranches worked, one thing fixed and another thing waiting. Garrett still ate cold suppers occasionally, though less often, because there were now 2 people managing the supper hour, and sometimes that meant the food was still warm when they both sat down. But the house breathed differently. That was the thing Clara noticed, and couldn't have explained to someone who hadn't been inside both versions of it. Before, she'd only caught glimpses of the before, in Rose's careful formality and Garrett's weight-bearing silences, and Eli's way of talking to her like she was the person he'd been saving things up to tell. Before, the house had been a place where people were surviving, doing the necessary things, getting through. Now it was a place where Nate's laugh could set all of them off without warning, where Rose argued passionately about whether her arithmetic homework was actually wrong, or if the teacher was wrong, where Eli came home from school with opinions about everything and nobody told him to quiet down, where Garrett occasionally came in from a long day in the field and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the noise and mess of it with an expression that took Clara time to read correctly. Not exhaustion, not management, something else. Relief. The relief of a man who had spent 2 years being afraid the life was leaving the house and had started to believe it might stay. She saw it one evening in June, supper done, children dispersed into their various orbits, the kitchen quieted to the sound of the fire, and 2 people finishing the dishes. Garrett handed her the last plate, and she dried it and set it on the shelf and turned to find him looking at her with that expression. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Don't say nothing when you have a look like that. He was quiet for a moment, then, I was thinking about September. September. When you were sitting on the hotel porch. He leaned against the counter. I walked by twice before Eli ran ahead and talked to you. I'd noticed you the day before." Clara looked at him. "You didn't say anything." "I didn't know what to say." He looked at the middle distance with the particular expression of a man admitting something that costs him a small amount of pride. "I was out of practice." "Out of practice with what?" "Noticing people." A beat. "Noticing women." He said it plainly, not making it larger or smaller than it was. "After Margaret, I just stopped. It wasn't a decision. It was more like a door closing. I didn't plan to open it again." "And then Eli talked to me on the porch," Clara said. "And then Eli talked to you on the porch," he confirmed. "And I came over to collect him. And you weren't feeling sorry for yourself. You were sitting there holding something terrible and not letting it eat you." He was quiet for a moment. "I noticed that." Clara thought about the woman on that porch. $8, dead uncle, envelope full of debt, fighting to keep her face together. "I wasn't as composed as I looked," she said. "I know," he said. "That was the part that mattered. Anyone can look composed. You were composed while something was actually happening." She didn't know what to say to that. "I went to the feed store and stood there for 10 minutes not feeding my horses," he said, thinking, which I don't usually do, standing in feed stores. The ghost of the not-quite smile. "Eli came back and said you looked like you needed a friend. He's 6, so he didn't know that wasn't simple to be." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He knew what he was doing," she said. "He always does," Garrett said, with the tired, fond exasperation of a parent who has accepted that their child is inexplicably wiser than him. "I just catch up late." She looked at him in the kitchen of the house that was hers now, in the lamplight of a June evening with all 3 of his children upstairs making the sounds of children who are home. And she thought about September. The bench, the cold, the $8, the running arithmetic of survival, and how none of it had looked like a beginning from inside it, had looked like nothing but an ending, and how the distance between those two things was, in the end, a 6-year-old boy asking a simple question. "You caught up," she said. He reached out and took her hand, the same way he'd taken it in the barn in March, simply, without decoration, and held it. "Working on it," he said. Outside, the June evening was doing what June evenings do in Colorado, going gold, going slow, the light refusing to leave. The apple trees along the south fence were past their bloom now, into the serious green of building fruit, and somewhere in the kitchen garden, Margaret's tomatoes were climbing their stakes along the east side where the morning sun was best. Upstairs, Nate was saying something with great insistence in the language that was mostly his own, and Rose's voice answered, and then Eli's, and then all 3 of them were laughing at something Clara couldn't hear from down here, the laughter coming through the ceiling like something alive. Garrett heard it. She felt his hand tighten slightly around hers. Not much. Just enough. The tomatoes came in August. Not all of them. The row nearest the fence had struggled with something in the soil, too much clay, not enough drainage, and Clara had spent 2 weeks in July trying to correct it with the particular stubbornness of a woman who doesn't accept losing to dirt. Some of those plants made it, some didn't. The ones along the east wall, though, Margaret's side, the morning sun side, those came in heavy and red and more than the household could use fresh. Rose stood at the edge of the garden on the Saturday they harvested and looked at the yield with an expression that Clara had learned to read by now, the look that meant something was happening inside her that she hadn't decided yet whether to name. She'd have put them up, Rose said, canned them. She had a whole system. "Do you remember it?" Clara asked. "Some." Rose picked up one of the largest tomatoes and turned it in her hands. She wrote things down somewhere. I don't know where. "The seed tin," Clara said. Rose looked at her. "The inside of the lid," Clara said. "There's writing on more than just the seed list. I noticed it in May, but I didn't want to say anything until you were ready to look." They found it that afternoon. Margaret's handwriting covering every available surface inside the tin lid and along the folded paper lining, not just seeds, but notes. Small, practical notations in the margins that were essentially a manual for the kitchen garden across a full year. Quantities. Timing. Which varieties she'd liked better and which had disappointed her and why. East tomatoes. More water in July. Don't let them dry out between the stones. And at the bottom of one folded page, in writing that looked slightly different, slightly less certain, as though it had been written at a harder time. "For whoever tends this after me. The garden wants to grow. It just needs someone paying attention. Rose read it twice. She didn't cry. She was 9 now, and grief had taught her its own specific language. But she held the paper carefully, the way she'd held the flowers at the wedding, at the angle of something she was carrying for someone else. She knew, Rose said. Clara sat beside her on the ground without worrying about the dirt. Knew what? That someone else would be here. Rose looked at the paper. She wasn't writing it for us. We already knew everything. She was writing it for the next person. Clara didn't say anything. The thing about children who've grown up fast is that sometimes they arrive at true things from directions adults can't follow, and the best you can do is stay present while it happens. I think she would have been okay with you, Rose said. Not generously. Not the way people say things to be kind. She said it the way she said everything important, carefully, after thinking about it, meaning it exactly. I didn't know how to think about that before, but now I think she would have been okay with you specifically. Clara held that for a moment. Why specifically? Because you didn't pretend, Rose said. Everybody else pretends. Papa used to pretend things were fine when they weren't. The ladies in town pretended we were doing well when they brought food and felt sorry for us. But you never pretended anything. You just said what was true. She set the paper down gently. Mama was like that too. Clara pressed her hand flat against the ground between them for a moment, on the turned earth of the garden that Margaret had planned and Rose had started and she had helped finish. I'm glad you told me that, she said. It's true, Rose said simply. And then, with the abrupt gear shift of a 9-year-old who has said what she came to say, can we do the canning today, before the rest of them go soft? They canned tomatoes all afternoon, Clara and Rose and Agnes Tully, who had appeared mid-afternoon uninvited with her own jars and her own opinion about water bath temperatures, which turned out to be identical to Margaret's noted opinion, which Agnes received without surprise because she had learned long ago that practical women arrive at the same conclusions by different roads. By evening, the kitchen smelled of August and industry, and there were 14 jars cooling on the counter, and Eli had eaten 2 tomatoes raw off the vine and gotten the front of his shirt catastrophically stained and was pretending it hadn't happened, and Nate was asleep in the corner chair with tomato on his face and an expression of complete contentment. Garrett came in from the barn and stood in the kitchen doorway the way he had in June, looking at the chaos of it, the productive, wonderful mess. He looked at Clara. She looked back. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be shown. The north pasture flooded in September, right on schedule, because the north pasture always flooded in September, and no amount of love or determination was going to renegotiate with the geography of the land. Garrett lost 3 days to the drainage work, coming in after dark with mud to the knee and the expression of a man at war with something that refuses to be beat. And Clara kept supper warm and didn't say I told you so about the temporary drainage channel she'd suggested in June that he had declined to build because he'd thought the season would be drier. On the 3rd evening, he came in and sat at the table and she put food in front of him and he said, "You were right about the channel." "I know," she said. She sat down across from him. "We can do it in October when the ground dries, before next year's runoff season." He looked at her. "You're not going to make me say it twice?" "No," she said. "You said it. That's enough." He ate for a while. Then, "I had a conversation with Henderson today." "About?" "He wants to expand the agreement, more horses, ongoing supply. He's got a partner in Denver looking for consistent stock." He was being careful about how he said it, which meant there was something he was working toward. "It would mean more work, more animals. Probably need to hire a hand." "Okay," she said. "It would also mean more income. Consistent, not seasonal." He set down his fork. "Enough to repair the east barn roof and possibly, address the north drainage before next spring." Clara looked at him. "This is a good development." "It's a good development," he agreed. "I've been sitting on it for a week because I kept thinking I should have found it myself." "Garrett, I know," he said. He picked up the fork again. "I know it doesn't matter who found it. I know that. I'm just telling you where I was." "Because you're working on saying things," she said. "Because I'm working on saying things," he confirmed. "It's slow going." "You're doing better than you think," she said. He made the sound, the one that had started as a not-quite laugh and had become, over months of accumulated ordinary life, something she'd catalog as one of her preferred sounds in the world, The specific frequency of Garrett Rowan finding something funny against his own intentions. The Henderson arrangement went through in October. Garrett hired a young hand named Thomas, who was 17 and worked with the focused energy of someone who needs to prove something, which Garrett understood and Clara understood, and which meant Thomas fit into the rhythm of the ranch without much friction. He was also, as it emerged across the first 3 weeks, quietly terrified of Clara, in the way young men are sometimes terrified of women who run accounts and don't explain themselves, which Eli found endlessly entertaining and reported on regularly. "Thomas asked me if you were strict," Eli told her one morning, with the tone of a journalist delivering a scoop. "What did you say?" "I said you were fair," Eli said, in the voice of someone who has thought about the distinction and means it. "That's different from strict. Papa's strict sometimes. You're just clear." Clara looked at the boy who had talked to her on a hotel porch 14 months ago. I was 7 now, growing in the vertical direction with the urgency of a plant reaching for light, and his hair still needed cutting and his shirts were still washed to a faded version of their original color. But there was something in him, had always been something in him, that was just fundamentally certain about things in a way most adults spend their whole lives trying to learn. "That's a very precise observation," she said. "I have a lot of them," Eli said modestly. "Papa says I should be a lawyer. Rose says I should be a preacher. I'm thinking about it." "What do you think?" He considered this with serious weight. "I think I want to do what you do," he said, "figuring out what things are actually worth and what they're not." "That seems useful." Clara thought about herself at 7, Cincinnati, her mother's kitchen, the particular safety of a life that hadn't broken yet. She thought about the $8 and the broken plan and the bench on the hotel porch. She thought about what she would have told herself then if she'd been able to, and whether any of it would have been believable from inside that particular dark. Probably not. Most things that turn out to matter don't look like much from the beginning. They look like a stranger's child asking a question. They look like a dozen apples on a boarding house porch. They look like a gate that opens easy because someone quietly fixed it. "You'd be good at it," she told Eli. He nodded, already satisfied with this conclusion, and ran off toward the barn for reasons that remained his own. October brought the anniversary. Not their anniversary. That was April, and they'd marked it quietly, the two of them, while the children were at school and the ranch was briefly still. This was a different anniversary. The second year since Margaret. Garrett didn't mention it, and she didn't mention it first, but she was aware of it the way she was aware of most things that mattered in this household. Peripherally, steadily, with her full attention available if it was needed. The day was quiet. Garrett went out early and came back at midday and ate something without tasting it and went back out. Rose was solemn in the particular way that looked like ordinary Rose if you didn't know her well enough to see the difference. Eli, who was not always good at quiet but was occasionally wise about when it was required, kept his commentary minimal. That evening, after supper, after the children were in bed, Clara found Garrett sitting on the back porch in the dark. Not in distress, just sitting, in the specific way of someone who needs to be outside with their thoughts for a while. She brought 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside him, and didn't say anything. He held the cup with both hands and looked out at the dark where the south garden was, invisible now, just a shape in the September night. After a while he said, "She would have been 33 this December." "I know," Clara said. She'd found it in the household Bible last spring, Margaret's name and birthday written in the front in Garrett's handwriting, his own private record keeping. He stopped. "She was so certain about things. I used to think it was confidence, but I don't think that's what it was. She was just clear about what she wanted, about who she was." He drank some coffee. "I was always figuring things out slower. She used to wait for me to catch up without making it a thing. She was patient about it." Clara listened. This was the most he'd said about Margaret directly since the night they sat on the edge of the bed together in April, and she understood that the second year sometimes breaks open things the first year kept sealed. "She sounds like she knew her own mind," Clara said. "Completely," he said. "Even at the end, when she was sick and everything was, even then, she knew what she wanted. She wanted to be here, in this house, with the kids. She didn't want the hospital in Denver. I tried to get her to go." His jaw moved. She said, "That I want to be where my things are, where everything smells right." He was quiet for a moment. "So she was here. At the end, she was here." Clara sat with that. The weight of it, and also the rightness of it. A woman who knew what she wanted and asked for it, even at the end. I don't talk about her enough, Garrett said. To the kids. I know I don't. I don't know how to do it without... He stopped. Without it taking me apart. It's going to take you apart sometimes, Clara said. That's not failure. That's what it costs to have loved someone that way. He turned and looked at her in the dark. Doesn't that make it harder for you to hear about her? Clara thought about this honestly, the way she tried to think about honest questions. No, she said. Not the way you might think. She's in your kids' faces. She's in the seed tin. She's in the east row of tomatoes. She looked out at the dark garden. She's in the fact that you're a man who knows how to love people well. She had something to do with that. She paused. I'm not in competition with her. I never was. We just took different portions of your life. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the coffee went from hot to warm in their hands. Then, how do you do that? Do what? Say the thing that's true without making it hurt less than it actually does. Clara thought about it. I had a lot of practice with the exact weight of things, she said. The last 2 years. You learn to carry things their actual size instead of making them smaller or bigger. He nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. Yeah. They sat until the coffee was cold and the dark had gone complete, and the stars over the Colorado mountains were doing their usual indifferent and magnificent thing, and Garrett leaned back in his chair and looked up at them. And for the first time since she'd known him, he looked, not light, that wasn't the word, but unburdened. Not weightless, because the weight was real and permanent, just no longer carrying it alone. That was the difference. She'd figured out that was the whole difference. Not the removal of weight, but the redistribution of it. Not fixing the hard things, but standing next to them together. November came with a letter. It came addressed to Clara Rowan, which still caught her sideways sometimes when she saw it written down. The new shape of her name on an envelope. The declaration of it in someone's handwriting. This one was from a solicitor in Cincinnati, the firm where she'd kept accounts for 2 years. And it took her a moment to understand what she was reading. Her mother's sister, an aunt she'd met twice, a woman named Vera, who had lived in the East her whole life and apparently outlasted several other relatives, had died in September and left a modest estate. The estate, by the terms of a will Clara had never known existed, was partly hers. Not a fortune. The solicitor was careful about that, laying out the numbers in the specific language of legal documents that wants to be clear before it is anything else. But it was not nothing. It was enough to matter. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter and read it 3 times. Then she went to find Garrett. He was at the east fence with Thomas, and she waited at the edge until Thomas took the hint and found somewhere else to be, and then she handed Garrett the letter and watched him read it. He looked up. Clara, I know. This is yours, he said, carefully, making sure she heard it. Ours, she said. Don't argue with me about this, Garrett. I've made my decision. He looked at the letter again. Something moved through his face. Not the tightness, not the weight-bearing expression. Something else. Something she'd seen only occasionally, in the barn in March and on the back porch in October, and the evening he'd watched Nate hand her a wooden block across 3 feet of air. Something that was simply, purely, uncomplicated. The north drainage, he said. The north drainage, she agreed. And the east barn roof, and Thomas's wages through spring, so you're not carrying that uncertainty. She paused. And Rose has been asking about school in Denver, the one Pearl Hensley mentioned. There's a session next summer for girls her age. He looked at her. You've been planning. I've been thinking, she said. It's slightly different. It's not different, he said, but without argument, just recognizing something true. You plan the way other people breathe. Is that a problem? No. He folded the letter and held it for a moment before handing it back. No, it's one of the things. He stopped. I don't say enough of the things. You say them when they matter, she said. You just said one. He looked at her across the fence line with the expression that was becoming, over the accumulated months and seasons of their life together, the one she'd come to think of as simply his, not performed, not managed, just Garrett Rowan looking at her from inside the real version of his life. I'm glad Eli talked to you, he said. So am I, she said. I'm glad you came to Silver Creek. I didn't have many other options, she said. No, he said. But you came anyway, and you stayed. He looked at the ranch around them, the east barn needing its roof, the north pasture already planning its spring betrayal, the south garden put to bed for the winter, the house with its 3 children and its imperfect kitchen and its gate that opened easy. You chose this. I chose this, she said. The apple tree bloomed the following May. It had bloomed the year before too, while Clara was still new to the ranch, still learning where everything was and what everything meant, but she hadn't been paying attention to the right things yet. This year she saw it. The tree along the south fence, the old one that had gone wild the year Garrett first brought apples to the boarding house, the one that produced more than they could use, that had been the first thing he offered her that wasn't necessity, that was just generosity. This year it bloomed in the 3rd week of May in that particular apple blossom white that smells like the best version of every spring you've ever had. Rose saw it first. She called everyone out, which meant there were 5 people, and Thomas standing in the May yard looking at an apple tree, which was possibly the most Silver Creek thing that had ever happened. But nobody questioned it because Rose had called them out with the specific urgency of someone who knew a moment when she saw one. Nate, who was 3 now and in possession of enough language to have opinions about most things, pointed at the tree and said, "Pretty." "Yeah," Eli said. I was standing with his hands in his pockets, which was new. Eli with his hands in his pockets instead of in motion was a sign of growth that still caught Clara off guard occasionally. "Mama liked that tree." "I know," Rose said. "She planted it." Nobody had told Clara that. She looked at the tree with the particular feeling of information, arriving late and rearranging things it hadn't been expected to rearrange. Garrett was standing beside her. She didn't look at him, and he didn't look at her, but she felt the change in him, the way you feel weather, the shift in pressure, the thing moving through the air. "She planted it the year Rose was born," he said quietly, said she wanted something that would outlast her. Clara looked at the blooming tree, at the white flowers in the May light, at the old trunk that had been growing here for 9 years and intended to keep going, at the branches extending over the fence line with the confidence of something that had decided to stay. "It did," Clara said. "Yeah." His voice was steady. Not easy. Nothing was ever simply easy. That wasn't the truth of things. But steady. The specific steadiness of a man who has learned to hold something real without bracing against it. The children were already moving, Nate toward the fence to touch the trunk, Eli throwing something at nothing in particular, Rose with her face tipped up toward the blooms in the way she sometimes stood in the garden, taking stock. "I'm going to make the worst apple pie you've ever eaten when those come in," Clara said. Garrett looked at her. "I can do many things," she said. "Pie is not one of them." He made the sound, the laugh against his will, the one that had become the sound she measured good days by. "I know," he said. "I've had your pie." "And?" "It's ambitious," he said, "in ways that don't consistently pay off." She laughed. He laughed. Eli looked over at them laughing and grinned with the uncomplicated pleasure of a child who has decided that his parents being happy is one of the better things that can happen in a day, and went back to whatever he was throwing at nothing. The May afternoon settled around them. The ranch and its perpetual imperfections, the tree Margaret planted, the children she'd raised, and the man she'd left behind, and the woman who had come with $8 and a broken plan and stayed because some things are worth staying for. The north pasture was already threatening next spring's flooding with the current look of the drainage. The east barn roof had been fixed in March and immediately developed a different problem in a different location, because that was the nature of roofs. Thomas had turned out to have a decent instinct with horses and a terrible instinct with fences, so they worked with what they had. Nothing was resolved in the way of stories that tie up cleanly. The county was still the county. Harold Briggs was still Harold Briggs, though he'd been observably more careful in his language around Clara since the March conversation, which she considered an acceptable outcome. Edwin Marsh had taken a position in Denver, and Pearl Hensley reported, was engaged to a woman from a banking family who sounded genuinely delighted with him, which was the right ending for Edwin Marsh. Agnes Tully came to Sunday supper in November and insulted the cornbread and stayed for 4 hours, which was Agnes's version of high praise. Walter Marsh moved his account to the laundry and eventually admitted to Agnes's face that it was the best-run business in Silver Creek, which Agnes received with and then went to find something to do before she said something sentimental. The laundry ran, the ranch ran. Two imperfect things running together, which was the actual shape of a shared life. Not the merging of two perfect things, but the collaboration of two real ones. Rose went to the summer session in Denver the following year. She came back 3 weeks later taller in a way that had nothing to do with height, with opinions about mathematics, and a book she'd bought with her saved money, and the quiet certainty of a girl who has discovered that her mind is one of the better places she has access to. She hugged Clara at the station in a way she hadn't before, quick, real, without ceremony, and then immediately started telling Eli everything he'd been wrong about for the past 3 weeks. Eli disputed this at length. The argument lasted through supper and continued the next morning and was still technically unresolved by the following week, which was completely normal. Nate grew. He said Clara's full name at 2.5, not Ka anymore, but Clara, with the satisfaction of a small person who has been working on something and arrived. He said it to her one morning at breakfast, just looked up from his food and said it, and she'd looked at his serious little face and said, "Yes, that's right," and gone back to the dishes. And it was the most ordinary, enormous moment she could imagine, and she would not have traded it. The apple tree came into fruit in August. Clara made the pie. It was, by any fair accounting, a structural problem more than a culinary achievement. The crust cooperated on the edges and made its own decisions in the middle, and the filling had a relationship with its thickening agent that could be described as complicated. Garrett ate 2 slices. "You don't have to," she said. "I want to," he said. "It's not good." "No," he agreed, "but you made it." He cut a 3rd slice. She sat across from him at the table where she had sat 100 times now, in the kitchen where she had washed dishes and organized accounts and learned the sounds the house made at different hours of the night, in the life she had built from the bottom of something that looked, from inside it, like nothing but an ending. The window was open. August came through it, warm and complex, carrying the smell of the garden and the dry grass and the distant creek, and the particular scent of August evenings that is not quite summer and not quite the thing after summer, something in between, alive and not finished yet, and aware of time passing without being afraid of it. That, she thought, was what forward felt like. Not arrival, not the completion of something difficult, just the ordinary, ongoing fact of a life you chose, in a place you stayed, with people who became yours not because blood or obligation said so, but because you showed up again and again, in the small, unglamorous ways that actually build something, and they showed up back. She had come to Silver Creek with $8 and a dead man's letter and no plan that held. She had an apple tree now, a gate that opened easy, a boy who threw things at nothing, and a girl who understood her own mind, and a baby who said her name right. A man who ate cold suppers less often and said the things sometimes and was working on saying them more. She had the ledger and the garden and the mornings and the ordinary disasters of the north pasture and the east barn and whatever would come next, which she could not predict and was no longer trying to. It was not the life she'd planned. It was better than the life she'd planned, in the way that real things are always more complicated and more surprising and more worth fighting for than anything you imagine from a safe distance. That was the thing nobody told you about starting over. It didn't look like starting over from the inside. It looked like a child asking you a question on a hotel porch. It looked like apples on a boarding house step. It looked like the smallest possible beginning, and you didn't know until much later, looking back from the other side of it, that that was exactly what it was. The beginning of everything.